Hello, everybody. We're going to wrap up our logic and our sets and logic unit here with a two-part lecture on how to make an argument appropriately. And we'll call these logical arguments. So jumping right in, we're going to have several sort of components to an argument. But the biggest thing to remember is that an argument is just a compound statement. So while it will seem sort of big and ugly and confusing, it's just a compound statement at its core. There's several parts to this. There are some premises and a conclusion, and we'll talk about what those are in just a second. And then an argument in its entirety, it can either be valid or invalid based on the truth values of the simple statements that make it up. I know that's a lot that I just said. Let's kind of dive into it and dissect it piece by piece. So we'll first look at premises and conclusions. So a premise is just any kind of statement. It can be either simple or compound, but it precedes a conclusion. It comes before this conclusion. So just like you'd say, oh, the premise of the movie is, blah 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 blah. You're making a statement about that movie that comes before the final conclusion of, it was good or something like that. So you'll have one or two or three or four or five premises, and those will come before our final conclusion. Then our conclusion is going to be the result that we are claiming is true based upon all the premises. So we have a bunch of ideas, we have a bunch of statements about a movie that we watch, and you come to a conclusion about that movie based upon those statements that came before. And the key thing to remember here is that this conclusion, you're claiming that it's true, and then our job is to figure out whether it's valid or invalid, whether that's true or not. So arguments will always be in this sort of format. Okay, so we're going to start off with a bunch of premises. So you're going to have a premise and a premise and a premise and another premise and maybe another premise. You might have a lot of them, but all of that is in an if-then with this conclusion. So let's use an example there. I could make an argument. I could say, if the stove is on and let me actually highlight things as I'm doing this. If the stove is on, that's my first premise, and the food is warm and the table is set, then we are ready for dinner. And that we are ready for dinner is my conclusion. And that's in an if-then with all of these things that have to precede it. So I come out with all these premises that say, hey, the food is hot, the stove is off, the table is set. We're ready for dinner now, right? And so this is just a giant if-then statement where all of our premises are sort of lumped together with ands. And so you could have someone make an argument. You could say, hey, let's go with a stern voice here to make it sound more like an argument. You could say, hey, if the stove is off and the food is hot and the table is set, then we're ready for dinner. And it's up to us to figure out whether that argument is valid or invalid. To me, it sounds like a valid argument just at face value, just because, yeah, if all those things in the beginning are true, then the conclusion is probably true. But we're going to have to dissect that more carefully when we don't know whether or not these original premises are true or false. One thing I want to note here, this symbol right here, this double arrow, it means the exact same thing as the single arrow. It means an if-then statement. So these two things are exactly the same. Don't ask me why people use one or the other. It's kind of just personal preference. Our book tends to use the single arrow, but sometimes you'll see a double arrow. So just pointing it out. I kind of flip-flop back and forth between them. So just be careful and look out for both of them. So what we like to do when we've got all these premises preceding this conclusion, we like to write them in this format here. This is a nice little table format, and it's a lot more concise than writing out this entire, ugly compound statement. This is just a much more concise form of P1, let's call it premise 1, 2, 3, P1 and P2 and P3, all in an if-then with my conclusion, C. This that I wrote down here at the bottom is just, it looks ugly, it's written horizontally, so it takes up a lot of space. When I write it in this table format here, it's a lot cleaner and it looks a lot nicer, at the expense of not actually having these symbols anywhere in this table. So I think that's kind of a fault of this table format. You don't get these symbols here, these ands and the if then. You have to remember that those are there. But we'll generally write our arguments in this form. Next lecture, we're going to see this form just all over the place. So we'll get comfortable with this. We'll practice writing arguments in this form. So let's go ahead into an example. And here's an argument that I'm going to make. If the ad campaign is a success, the marketing manager won't lose her job. Then I tell you that the marketing manager lost her job. Therefore, the ad campaign wasn't a success. To me, just looking at this seems like it's a valid argument. It seems like, yeah, I could nod at that and say, that makes sense. But I don't really know for sure. So let's write this out in an argument format, and let's actually figure out what our premises are and what our conclusions are. And how I like to do that is starting off just at the root of this argument. And that has to do with the simple statements, okay? And when I look at this, I see ad campaign is a success. That's a very simple statement. And by definition, it's a simple statement. It's a statement that only encapsulates one idea. The second statement could be the marketing manager lost her job. Okay? And notice, and actually let me be careful here. Let me not underline the won't. So I'm going to let A and B be the red and the blue, right? So be careful on B, how I'm choosing to define it. I'm going to define it as the marketing manager lost her job. Even though up here in the statement it says won't lose her job, the simplest format of that idea is that she lost her job, as opposed to saying she didn't lose her job. So we've got these, A and B. The ad campaign was a success. The marketing manager lost her job. So I can take the first and the second and the third sentence of this whole argument, and I can basically just use A and B, and I can form compound statements with them. And so what I'm seeing here is this first sentence here, that to me looks like an if-then statement. And in fact, it looks like if A, then not B, right? So if the ad campaign is a success, well, that's going to be, there's an if, and so I definitely have my if then. And then the ad campaign is a success, that's my A. And then the marketing manager won't lose her job, that's a not B, because B says that she did lose her job. But up here, I'm saying she won't lose her job. So the first sentence can be written like this: if A, then not B. The second sentence is the marketing manager lost her job. Well, that's just exactly what B was. So the second sentence is very plainly written, just B right there. This third and last sentence, therefore, the ad campaign wasn't a success. The easy part for us to look at is the ad campaign was not a success. Well, A was that the ad campaign was a success. And I'm telling you that it wasn't here. So that third sentence is going to be a not A. And you're probably finally looking at this weird dotted triangle and you're like, what the heck is that? This dotted triangle here means therefore. It's just a shorthand way of writing therefore. So that third sentence, I'd put my three little dots and then a not A, because it's saying therefore, not A. So we've got our first, our second, and our third sentences. Now we actually want to figure out where in this do we have a premise and where do we have a conclusion? I think the conclusion is easy to figure out here where it is. And I think it's the third sentence. Because I say all this stuff happened. I say, hey, the ad campaign lost her job, all this stuff. And then I say, therefore, the ad campaign wasn't a success. So I'm coming to this conclusion that after all has been said and done, the ad campaign was not a success. So this third sentence is going to be the conclusion. And remember, back in this table format, we put the conclusion down at the bottom here underneath like a horizontal bar. So let me jump ahead. This third sentence, that's down at the bottom there underneath that bar. That's where we put that conclusion because we've determined that that therefore not a, that's our conclusion. That conclusion, we have arrived at it from two different premises. And those premises were exactly the first and the second sentence. Those are the things that preceded the conclusion. Those are things that we knew to be true. They happened, they're there. And because of those things, we come to our last final conclusion. So like we write in the table format, we have our premise, and I'll call this premise number 1. And we have our second premise. And then we have our conclusion. And if I wanted to, I could put a ... here. So premise 1 and premise 2, therefore, I come to a conclusion. And that's how we can take this argument that is verbally written out, and we can write it in a very, very succinct way here. All right, so we've done all this. We've written this whole argument format out. And the question is it even true or not, right? That was the original question that we were getting at. Is this even valid, right? And so let's actually just go ahead and do this. Now, we got to be careful. This might seem like a lot and it'll get complicated. Remember, when we have this table format, this is just a concise way of writing the full written out compound statement here, where I take all my premises, I put them together with ands, and then I do that whole thing in an if then with the conclusion, okay? So we'll keep that in the back of our heads. So basically what we're gonna do here is I'm gonna take premise 1, which I have written down right there. I'm gonna take premise 2, which I have written down there. I'm going to and those together. That's going to give me something. Once I and those together, I'm going to do that whole thing in an if then with my not a, the conclusion. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's take this step by step. Again, I'll write this out. We got premise number 1, premise number 2. I'll abbreviate these P1 and P2. We've got therefore conclusion. I'll abbreviate that with a C. P1, P2, C. So what we're seeing down here, this column here is P1, right? That's just if A, then not B. That's exactly that first premise that I've got. This column here is P1 and P2, right? I'm anding each of the premises. So I'm looking right here, P1 and then P2, just B for P2. And I'm anding them together. That's how I'm sort of combining them. Then what I'm doing finally is I'm doing P1 and P2 in an if then with the conclusion, C. Let me give myself some different colors here, make it look a little nicer. So our final result here, like we've talked about, these arguments that we make, they're always premise and premise and premise and premise, all in an if then with a conclusion. So this is the final compound statement that I'm looking for. It looks very ugly, but I've got my P1 right there. And I've got my P2 right there. In an if-then, all of that, I use these brackets, all of that in an if-then with my conclusion, not A. So let's fill in this truth table. We're hopefully fairly quick at these truth tables now. We've been doing them for some time. Not A and not B. Those should be straightforward. Fill those in. If A, then not B. So again, I do this a lot. I'm not even gonna look at these columns here. I'm just gonna do an if then with the two columns that are visible to you right now. So let's go ahead and do that. I have if true, then false. That's gonna be false. I have an if true, then true. That's gonna be a true. I have an if false, then false. That's going to yield a true. And again, I'm just doing if thens here. I have an if false, then true. That's going to yield a true. Now I'm going to take this column and I'm just going to AND it with the B column. So I don't even care about these or that A. I'm just doing an AND between the two visible columns right now. And if we do that, I end up with an F, a T, and an F. Now I'm doing an if then with this part as the if, that's this column here, and then the not A. So again, I'm just looking at these two columns that are visible. And I'm just doing an if then with the one on the right. So if the column on the right, then the column on the left. So we'll look here and we'll see if false, then false. That's true. Then I say if false, then false. That's same thing, true. If true, then true. That's true. And then lastly, if false, then true. And that's in fact true. And hopefully you remember here, this that we've achieved, we've gotten this whole final argument written out in a compound statement, and we've calculated the truth values, and no matter what, we always get true. That is a tautology. And tautologies we love when it comes to arguments, because wouldn't it be awesome if you make an argument and you're always right, no matter what? And that's what happens here in this case. Not all arguments are tautologies, some aren't, but in this case, because we know that this argument is always true, we can say that it's valid. And that was something that I started off with in the very beginning. We can say that that argument is valid. Now, let me be clear. Coming back to this original part, I have never told you whether or not the ad campaign was a success. I never told you whether the marketing manager actually lost her job or not. I have never told you whether A and B are true or false. But what I've shown you is that regardless of whether they're true or false, the argument that was made stands, and it is a valid argument. And so that's where we know that this argument is really, really awesome and it's valid, is because it doesn't matter what happened in real life. It doesn't matter whether the ad campaign was a success or whether the marketing manager lost her job. It just tells you that, yeah, the argument that was made, it's true, it holds. If the ad campaign was a success, the marketing manager won't lose her job. Well, the marketing manager lost her job, therefore the ad campaign wasn't a success. Yeah, that's valid. That's true. And again, just harping on this, it doesn't matter whether she actually lost her job or not, or whether the ad campaign is a success. It's just important to remember that this compound statement here, this argument is true, regardless of what happened in the real world. I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. And that'll be the first part of our logical arguments lecture. On the next lecture, we're going to look at common types of arguments and get to the point, hopefully, where we can just look at an argument structure and just say, that's valid or that's not valid. And I'll go ahead and leave you there.